Welcome back to GCC Kids Connection, where we are connecting with each other while you're home from school. We're connecting with some really cool books, and most importantly, we're connecting with God's Word. We're so glad you're here.
Hi kids, welcome back to GCC Kids Connections. When we were together yesterday, we met a cute little puppy named Spunky. And when we left Spunky, he was getting into some trouble on a farm. His friend Mark and family had gone to visit cousins at the farm, and Spunky was kind of left on his own to discover the farm. And if you remember, he made a big splash with the big yellow cat. He sent chickens scattering all over the place, and sent some cows and calves running to the other end of the field. Well, let's see who else Spunky might run into on the farm, and we'll see if he has as much power as he thinks he does. We're ready to begin with Chapter 8 of Spunky's Diary. At one end of the farm, I came to a fenced-in pen. Lying on her side in the warm sun was a huge pig. At her side were many little piglets. The big pig lay perfectly still, now and then flicking an ear at a fly that buzzed around her head. The piglets wiggled and squirmed and squealed and grunted as they ate their dinner. I sat and watched the strange-looking family. The piglets looked too busy to pay any attention to me, but that big one looked like she could be fun. I wondered if she'd climb a tree like the cat, or scatter like the chickens, or would she run off to the other end of the pen like the calves did? I pushed under the fence and walked slowly. When I got near her head, I stopped. Oh my, she was big, much bigger than the cat or the chickens. I took a deep breath and barked, ready for all the fun to begin. With one giant heave, the pig thrust herself into the air and onto her feet. Little pigs flew in every direction, squealing and running. With a grunt that shook the ground, the pig tossed her head and came straight for me. I wanted her to run, but I wanted her to run away from me, not toward me. I barely had time to scamper under the fence. I finally reached the fence, and with a quick duck, I was under and out. I was so frightened I couldn't even bark. I didn't quit running until I reached the house, and then I crawled under the porch and lay there panting. The giant pig kept grunting. I was afraid she might tear her way through the pen and come after me. After a while, she settled down and my heart returned to its normal pace. It was a long time until I felt brave enough to crawl out from under the porch again, and then it was only because Mark came looking for me to give me some lunch. For the rest of the day, I stayed close to Mark and the other children, sharing in their games and even playing in the creek. But the pig was on my mind. How could I get her back? Just as the Dobsons were saying their last goodbyes to the cousins, I got an idea. I snuck away and dashed over to the pig pen. I crept up as close to the fence as I dared, and I let out one wild bark. I only stayed long enough to catch her angry head whirl around and look at me. Then I turned and ran for the safety of Mark in the car. I rode home with a smug look on my face. That big pig wasn't as great as she thought she was after all. Grinning to myself, I had to agree with Mark that the farm was a really fun place. "It's so hot," Mark said to me one day while we were sitting in the backyard. He was right. Even in the shade, it was too hot to catch a ball. I was so thirsty that Mark had to refill my water dish 3 times. My tongue hung out the side of my mouth, and I kept panting. The sun was beating down so hard, even the flowers looked sad. Mrs. Dobson gave them some water, and then she smiled. "Hey, I have a great idea." Mark and Tracy looked up and said, "What, Mom? What?" "Let's turn on the sprinkler so you guys can play in the water," Mrs. Dobson said. "Yay!" screamed Tracy. "Hooray!" Mark shouted. "Let's get in our swimsuits." "I'll call our friends," Tracy yelled. There was so much excitement I hardly knew what was going on. Kids running in and out of the house, Mrs. Dobson with a strange-looking machine in the lawn, and suddenly, water! Water everywhere! And it felt so good. Mark and the others squealed through the spray of water as it came out of the sprinkler. I ran after them, and the water trickled down on my feet and my stomach. I was curious about the sprinkler. I inched closer to have a little sniff. I wasn't expecting all that water to go right up my nose. I sneezed while I backed away, and Mrs. Dobson laughed at me. I wanted to laugh too, because it was a great day. Chapter 10 is called School. School. I had heard that word a lot the last few days. Everyone was so excited about it, I could hardly wait to go. The Dobsons had books and pencils and crayons all laid out. They had new lunch boxes with their names on them. Tracy had a new shirt and jeans laid out, and Mark had new sneakers. I guess I would just have to go as I was. One morning, Mark and Tracy were up much earlier than usual. The house was buzzing with activity. I could hardly contain myself, and I ran back and forth from room to room, jumping and barking and watching. Everyone was getting ready for school. Mark and Tracy had breakfast, and I gulped down my food and waited by the door. Finally, after what seemed like an awfully long time, Mark cried out, "Here it comes!" A yellow bus came down the street. The kids shouted goodbye to their mom and hurried out the door. Quick as a flash, they were outside, and I scurried after them. Mark stopped me. "Spunky," he said, "we have to go to school. You have to stay here. Be a good boy." And then he was gone. There must have been some mistake. I had been so excited. I hurried through my breakfast so I'd be ready. I had washed myself as carefully as I could. Mrs. Dobson picked me up and brought me back inside. I squirmed, trying to get away, but she held me firmly. The last thing I saw before the door closed was Mark getting into that big yellow bus. I sat next to the door and whined. When that didn't work, I scratched and whined and whimpered. "Now, Spunky," Mrs. Dobson said, "you're going to have to get used to Mark and Tracy being at school. You'll miss them, but they'll be home this afternoon." That's when it hit me. I wasn't going to school. School was for children, not dogs, just like church. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. The house was quiet, and Mrs. Dobson didn't want to play too much. I lay there and felt sorry for myself. After some time, Mrs. Dobson opened the door and said, "There you go, Spunky. Go outside and play for a while." I waited for the door to close, and then I ran to the gate. School must not be for dogs, but I miss Mark. Maybe I can find him. The gate was shut tight. I pushed against it, but it didn't budge. I sat for a minute thinking, the flower beds. The dirt around the flowers is soft. I went right to work, and sure enough, in no time at all, I was able to wiggle and squirm my way under the fence. I raced to the sidewalk. The yellow bus was nowhere in sight. I put my nose to the ground, hoping to get some scent to guide me. There was just tire, exhaust, and concrete smells. I'd have to find Mark by instinct alone. I ran for a long way till my heart was pounding. I wondered if I should turn around and go back home, but I wanted to play with Mark. I just had to get to school, so I kept on running. I looked everywhere, but I never did see that yellow bus. Maybe the bus had turned on a different street, so I turned right at the next corner and trotted by many houses. Suddenly, I heard a loud growl next to me. My fur stood up on end and my feet were frozen in place. I shut my eyes, hoping that it would just disappear. There was a heavy crashing sound, and I opened my eyes just a bit. A big, mean dog had tried to attack me, but he was behind a tall wire fence. He threw himself at the fence again, but still, he wasn't able to get me. Phew, I sighed with relief. Boy, I sure was lucky. But I decided to move away from there very quickly, just in case he was able to push that fence down. I came to the end of the street. I wanted to cover my ears because there was so much traffic. It was noisy. Maybe the bus had come this way. I had to get across the street, so I stepped off the curb and began to make my way. Horns honked, tires screeched, and people from fast-moving cars yelled at me. I didn't know which way to go or what was happening. I ran as fast as I could to get to the grass on the other side. I crawled under a small bush and flopped down on the ground. I was panting and shaking with fright. My sides ached and my feet were scratched. I was scared and thirsty. I lay as quietly as I could, wondering what to do next. That's when it hit me. I didn't know where I was. I was lost. Not knowing how to get home, I just laid my head on my paws and I cried. I must have dozed off because when I lifted my head again, it was getting dark. I stretched out my feet. I needed to find a clue that would lead me home. Just then, I saw a lady watering her lawn. The water looked so good, so I ran over to get a drink from the hose. I guess the lady thought I was headed for her flowers because she quickly turned the hose on me and the cold water splashed hard against my face. "Get out of here," she yelled. I had been so close to getting a drink, and now I had to run away. I licked the drops of water from around my face, but I wished I had more. I found a place where the smell of good food was in the air. A few people were sitting outside at tables eating. I knew that it wasn't polite to beg, but I hadn't eaten since breakfast. So I pushed against one man's leg, but he wasn't willing to share. He chased me away with his newspaper. Oh, I missed the Dobsons and my nice home. I really missed Mark and the way he took care of me. Would I ever find him again? Just as I was about to give up all hope, I heard something. I perked my ears up and listened. Sure enough, I heard it again. "Spunky!" It was Mark. He had found me. I scrambled out from under the bush and ran in the direction of Mark's voice. I looked down the street, and there it was, the Dobsons' car. Mr. Dobson was driving slowly, and Mark was calling out the window. I ran after them, barking and wagging my tail. The car jerked to a stop, and Mark jumped out. Mark picked me up and held me close, so close that I could hardly wiggle with happiness. I was never so glad to see anybody in my whole life. "Oh, Spunky, where have you been? We've been looking and looking." I wanted to tell him that I had been looking and looking too, but I didn't quite know how to say it. Mark climbed back into the car and I sat on his lap and licked his face. I was so glad to see him, my home, my yard, my bed. "Spunky, I hope you never try to run away again." "I was so scared we'd never find you," Mark said as he scratched behind my ears. I wanted to tell him that he didn't need to worry. I would never leave home alone again, not even to find the yellow school bus. I much preferred to be home away from big dogs, screeching tires, and being lost. Just to show him how much I meant it, I jumped up and licked him on the face. Phew, I was worried there for a minute that Spunky wasn't going to find his way home. Well, thankfully, he did find his way home. And so our activity sheet for today has a couple more questions about Spunky. One page talks about Spunky and the pigs, Spunky and the sprinkler, Spunky goes to school, and then Spunky lost and found. There are a couple questions about each of those chapters, and then a place for you to draw a picture about what you think was happening in that particular part of Spunky's adventure. So I hope you enjoyed Spunky's diary, and maybe you'll want to begin a diary of your own to tell about what you've been doing while we've been home from school during these weeks. So have a good afternoon, and I'll see you again the next time.